Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about my ranged DPS tier list predictions for Dragonflight. This is going to be all about patch 10.1, the new season that we're going to be going into actually tomorrow. It's going to be pretty similar to my melee predictions video that I put out the other day, where we're going to be kind of covering every single spec and kind of giving a brief overview of how they were last season, and then we're going to talk about where I think they're going to be for season 2. And real quick before we get into this video, just like my previous one, I want to say that this is a quote-unquote predictions video. This is not set in stone. This is just me kind of looking over the data and making some educated guesses as to, where the different specs are going to be. So take everything I say with a grain of salt. But either way, these kind of videos are really fun to make. Don't forget to leave a like on this video if you guys enjoy the content, and subscribe to the channel if you guys haven't already. And with all that being said, let's get into the video. So Beast Mastery hunters have come a long way since Season 1, but much like a turtle, they kind of had the whole mantra of slow and steady wins the race because they're actually doing really good right now at the end of Season 1. For Mythic Plus, they were an A tier spec, and for rating, they were B tier. When you looked at Mythic Plus, about 15% of the ranged population were Beast Mastery hunters for doing plus 20 keys and higher. The one really unique thing about a BM hunter is that they're the only spec in the game that can do their entire rotation while moving, and their damage profile is all about just flat, consistent damage, and they just really don't have any burst. And while that definitely is kind of a downside to the spec, having a flat but consistent damage profile is actually really good for high-end keys when you're doing things like tyrannical bosses. They also have a pretty decent tier set, and if I was going to rate them for next season, I would say for Mythic Plus and for rating, they're going to be A tier. Marksmanship hunters are definitely living in the shadow of BM right now. They actually swapped places at the beginning of the expansion because right at the start, Marksman was actually really solid, but now Beast Mastery is doing better. However, I will say that just because BM's doing really good doesn't mean Marksmanship is bad. In fact, Marksman's doing really good too. And they are pretty much the exact opposite of Beast Mastery. So Marksmanship have some really strong AoE burst. Their single target is okay, but it's not as good as their AoE damage. They're making up about 10% of the population as far as plus 20 keys and above goes, and it looks like their tier set's actually going to be pretty good too. It seems like because of the 4-piece, their damage is probably going to be ramping up in execute phases. So as far as rating them for next season, I would say Marksmanship is going to be a B tier spec for both Mythic Plus and rating. If I had to rate Frost Mages for Season 1, I would say for Mythic Plus they were an A tier spec, and for rating they were B tier. They've got a pretty decent tier set, and of course, being a mage, mages have tons of utility and defensives. When you look at Mythic Plus, Frost Mages are at about 9% of the ranged population for plus 20 keys and above. And of course, mages have some awesome utility and buffs when it comes to rating, like Heroism or Time Warp, and of course, Arcane Intellect. Out of all the mage specs, I would say Frost is probably going to be the safe pick if you guys want to play a mage. And this is my opinion, but I unfortunately think Frost Mage is just really boring to play. So for Season 2, I'm going to put them in the A tier for Mythic Plus and Raid. So Fire Mages have definitely grown since last season. At the end here, in Mythic Plus, they're actually an S tier spec, and for rating, they're a C tier. And what's really crazy about that is, while there are some Fire Mages that are clearing plus 29 keys, they're only making up about 5% of the ranged population when it comes to clearing plus 20 and above keys for Mythic Plus. Their tier set seems like it's going to be really good, and Fire is just one of those specs that just always scales with gear, so I would say Fire is actually probably going to be a sleeper spec next season, but for the sake of rating them in this tier list video, I'm going to say that for Mythic Plus and for rating, they're going to be B tier. Arcane Mages started out really good, and then just kind of got nerfed into oblivion because they're really struggling right now. So for Season 1, for Mythic Plus and for rating, they're a D tier spec. They make up about 2% of the ranged population for plus 20 keys and above. Their tier set is not looking very good. Me personally, I feel like Arcane is just not very fun to play. I think the rotation is just way too complex for what it is. And I think just Mage overall just needs some really big reworks, kind of like Ret Paladin. But if I was going to rate Arcane Mage, I would say for Mythic Plus, they're going to be C tier, and for rating, I would put them in the B tier. Balanced Druid have been really strong the entire expansion, and Season 2 is no different. So for Season 1 in Mythic Plus, they were S tier, and for rating, they were B tier. Their tier set is looking really good. Balanced Druids bring a ton of buffs and utility for the raid. For Mythic Plus, they're making up about 10% of the population for plus 20 keys and above. And personally, I would say if you guys are looking for a really strong and solid ranged spec for just anything in the game, Balanced Druid is probably the best pick, because I'm going to put them in the S tier for both Mythic Plus and raiding for Season 2. Destruction Warlocks were pretty good last tier as well. For Mythic Plus, they were an S tier spec, and for raiding, they were A tier. It looks like they have a really good tier set this time around, and Warlocks are of course a spec that have a ton of utility like Lock Rocks, Gateways, and Soulstones. When you look at Mythic Plus, they were making up about 10% of the range population for plus 20 keys and above. They're also probably the easiest spec out of all the Warlocks to play, which is always nice. And I would say for Season 2, I'm going to put them in the A tier for both Mythic Plus and raiding. Demonology Warlocks were a C tier spec last season for Mythic Plus, and A tier for the raid. It looks like they have a pretty decent tier set going forward, and of course they're Warlock, so Warlock utility. They made up about 10% of the population for plus 20 keys and above for ranged. And if I was going to rate them for Season 2, I would say for Mythic Plus, they're going to be B tier, and for the raid, they're probably going to be an S tier. I think Demo Warlocks are just going to scale really well this season, and with their new tier set, I think they're going to be really good. Affliction Warlocks are in a similar situation as far as Arcane Mages goes. I think they're going to be the least popular spec for Warlocks. Last tier, they were a C tier spec for Mythic Plus and raiding. When you looked at the population for plus 20 keys and above, they only were 3%, so super low. I think if I was going to put them in a tier list for next season, I'd say for Mythic Plus, they're just going to stay in the C tier. And I think for raiding, they're going to be a little bit higher in the B tier. Mainly because I feel like Affliction is just not a spec that's built for Mythic Plus. However, I think with the right gear and the right scaling, they're going to probably do a little bit better as far as the raid goes. Shadow Priest were looking really good at the end of Season 1. With Mythic Plus, they were an A tier spec, and for the raid, they were B tier. Not only do they have a decent looking tier set, but their tier set just in general looks awesome. They've got some really good raid buffs like Fort, and of course Power Infusion, so a Shadow Priest is probably going to always have a spot in a raid. However, I will say that they're not very mobile, which kind of sucks. For Mythic Plus, they made up about 12% of the population for plus 20 keys and above, so a pretty high percentage. And for Season 2, I'm going to put them for Mythic Plus in the S tier and for raiding in the A tier. Elemental Shaman is another spec that's seen a lot of changes recently. For Season 1, they were an A tier spec for Mythic Plus, and for raiding, they were C tier. Ele Shamans look like they have a pretty good tier set going into Season 2, and Shamans always just have really good utility with things like Bloodlust, Self-Res, and of course Earth Elemental. They made up about 4% of the range population when it came to plus 20 keys and above, and for Season 2, I'm going to put them in the A tier for both Mythic Plus and raiding. Devastation Evokers have received a ton of changes recently. When you look at them for Season 1, for Mythic Plus they were C tier, and for the raid they were A tier. They made up about 7% of the population for ranged when you did 20 plus keys and above. Looking forward, they have a pretty good tier set, they're super mobile and have some really good utility. There was a data mined legendary for Evokers, so that's something to look forward to going forward. And with all the buffs and changes they've received recently, I feel like when it comes to Mythic Plus, they're going to be A tier, and for the raid, they're probably going to be an S tier spec. Alright, that should be where we're going to wrap up this video. Hopefully you guys got something out of this or just found it entertaining. Let me know in the comments what you guys think are going to be, S tier specs. Do you guys think I got this pretty accurate, or do you guys think I'm, totally off base as far as my predictions goes? And like I said, if you guys enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like to let me know, and subscribe to the channel if you guys are new here. Thank you so much for checking out my video, and I will see you guys later.